My son stood up at his rehearsal dinner and thanked every single person in that room. His new in-laws, his college friends, his colleagues, his wife's sorority sisters, his wife's dog walker for all I know. I found out about it 3 days later from my neighbor, who had been invited. That same morning, I called my attorney and transferred the title of his truck back into my name. That was my wedding gift to him. My name is Raymond. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 31 years driving an 18-wheeler across this country so that my son would never have to. I know every rest stop between Atlanta and Portland. I know what a February night feels like outside of Amarillo when the heater in the cab decides to quit. I know what it means to eat a gas station sandwich for the third day in a row because the delivery schedule doesn't wait for anyone, and neither does the mortgage. My back knows things my mouth has never said out loud. My knees remember every winter, every pothole, every 1,000-mile haul that I told myself I was doing for something bigger than myself. That something was my son. His mother passed when he was 11. Ovarian cancer, fast and brutal. She was here on a Thursday, and she was gone before the next one. After she died, it was just the two of us in a house that suddenly felt 3 times too large. I learned to cook, badly at first, and then passably. I learned to wash clothes without turning everything pink. I learned how to sit across a kitchen table from a grieving boy and find something to say that didn't make things worse. I wasn't a perfect father. I was away too much. The job didn't leave me a choice. But every time I pulled back into our driveway after 2 weeks on the road, I brought everything I had left back into that house. Every dollar I didn't spend on myself. Every hour I didn't sleep. All of it went to him. When my son was in high school, he told me he wanted to run his own business someday. Not drive a truck, he said, not meaning it as an insult, though it landed like one. Something of his own. I told him that was a fine thing to want. I told him to work toward it. He studied business administration at a state school, worked 2 jobs through it, graduated with honors. I cried at that graduation. I'm not ashamed to say it. I stood there in the bleachers in a collared shirt I'd ironed 3 times that morning, and I wept like I hadn't since his mother's funeral. After school, he spent 4 years working for a logistics company, learning the business from the bottom. He was sharp. He always had been. At 28, he came to me with a plan. He wanted to start his own freight brokerage. Small operation at first, build the client base, scale up. He'd done the research. He had a business plan typed up and printed, which he laid on my kitchen table like a lawyer presenting evidence. He just needed startup capital, about $60,000 to cover the first year of operations, insurance, licensing, software. I had $73,000 in a savings account. It had taken me 19 years to put it there. Every paycheck, every overtime run, every holiday shift. I didn't have a 401k worth much. I had that account and the house and my truck. I told my son to take $60,000 of it. I told him to keep careful records, pay it back when he was able, and not to worry if it took time. He sat across from me at that same kitchen table where I'd watched him do homework for years, and he looked like he was going to break down. He didn't. He swallowed it and reached across and gripped my hand and told me he would never forget what I was doing for him. I believed him. The brokerage did well, better than well, actually. Within 2 years, he had a steady roster of clients, a small team, and enough cash flow that the business was supporting itself. He paid me back $40,000 of the $60,000 in year 3, which I told him to keep. But he insisted. He said it was important to him. I respected that. Those were still the good years. He would call on Sundays. He would drive out to the house a couple times a month, and we would sit on the back porch and talk the way I'd always hoped we would talk when he was grown. Easy. Like 2 men who knew each other well and liked what they knew. Then he met her. Her name isn't important. What's important is who her family was. Her father owned a chain of distribution warehouses across 4 states. Old money by way of new money. The kind of family that has a vacation house and a primary house and refers to both with equal casualness. She was educated, polished, and pretty, and the first time I met her, I could tell she was already doing calculations. Not about my son, about me. He brought her to my house for dinner. One dinner, a Sunday in the fall, and I cooked a proper meal. Pork roast, potatoes, the green beans my wife used to make with bacon and onion. I set the table with the cloth napkins. I wore a clean button-down. I was ready to like her. I wanted to like her. She was the woman my son had chosen, and that was enough of a reason. She walked in behind him and smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. She looked at the living room slowly, the way a person looks when they're appraising something and finding it below estimate. Her eyes moved across the furniture, the carpet, the framed photos on the wall. They stopped briefly on my hands when I reached out to shake hers. I have working hands, big, rough, with a scar across my left palm from a loading dock accident in 2009. She shook my hand with about the same warmth you'd use to touch a stranger's umbrella. Dinner was polite and distant. She answered my questions with complete sentences, but nothing extra. She talked mostly to my son, occasionally pulling out her phone to show him something. A restaurant, a trip they were apparently planning. I asked about her family. She described them with the quiet pride of someone who has learned that describing what you have is its own language. I asked about her work. She said she was transitioning into a management role at her father's company. My son smiled at her the whole evening like a man who still couldn't believe his own luck. After they left, I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, and I tried to name the feeling in my chest. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't dislike, exactly. It was something quieter and more unsettling. It was the sense that a door was slowly closing somewhere, and I hadn't noticed soon enough to put my foot in it. The visits got shorter after that. Every few weeks became once a month. Once a month became every 6 weeks or so. The Sunday phone calls started going to voicemail. When he did call back, it was brief, that hurried voice of a man between things. "Hey Dad, sorry, it's been crazy." "Yeah, everything's good." "Yeah, I'll try to get out there soon. Busy season, you know how it is." He never asked how I was doing in a way that waited for the answer. I told myself it was normal. A man in his early 30s with a growing business and a serious relationship doesn't have the same bandwidth he had at 25. I told myself I wasn't going to be one of those fathers who makes his son feel guilty for having a life. So I gave him space. I gave him plenty of it. And he took every inch I offered and then some. About 8 months after that dinner, I was at the hardware store, and I ran into a man I'd known for years, my son's old Little League coach. He asked how my son was doing. I said he was doing well, busy, growing the business. The man smiled and said, "Well, that's good." He seemed happy at the engagement party last weekend. I kept my expression even. I asked what engagement party. The man looked confused for just a second, and then the way his face shifted told me everything. He said, "Oh, I thought you would have known. Sorry, I probably spoke out of turn." He changed the subject. I let him. I drove home and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes. My son had gotten engaged. He had thrown an engagement party at some venue, invited people who knew him from Little League 15 years ago, and had not called his father. I want you to understand what that moment felt like. Not the anger. The anger came later, and it was clean and useful. What I felt sitting in that driveway was something older and softer, and much harder to carry. It was the feeling of realizing that the door you thought was just drifting closed had already shut, quietly, while you were being patient and understanding, and giving him space. I called him that night. He answered on the second ring, which surprised me. "Hey, Dad." I told him I'd run into his old coach. I told him congratulations. I hadn't heard the news. There was a pause. A careful one. "Yeah," he said. "It kind of happened fast. We were going to tell everyone soon. Just wanted to keep it small at first." I asked him how an engagement party was keeping it small. Another pause. "Dad, it was more her family's thing. Her mother organized most of it. It just kind of grew. I didn't have much control over the list." I asked him flat out, "Was I on the list?" He didn't answer immediately, and the silence was my answer. I told him I was happy for him. I told him I hoped to meet her parents someday. I told him good night, and I hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that, not moving, looking at the table. The same table where I'd pushed $60,000 across to him without a single condition. He did not call me back. Weeks passed. 6, 7, 8 weeks without a word. I called twice. He answered once, briefly, said he was swamped with wedding planning and work, said he'd call when things calmed down. I asked if there was anything I could help with, anything he needed, any role he wanted me to play in the ceremony. He said he'd let me know. He didn't let me know. I'm not a man who uses social media much. I have an account on one of the platforms that my granddaughter's aunt, my cousin's daughter, set up for me 2 years ago so I could see family photos more easily. I check it maybe once a week, usually on Saturday mornings with my coffee. It was a Saturday morning when I opened the app and saw the photo at the top of my feed, shared by someone who must have been a mutual connection, a former colleague of my son's who I'd accepted a friend request from at some point. It was a wedding photo. My son in a dark suit, standing at an altar, laughing at something someone said. His wife beside him in white, her face turned toward him, radiant and real. Behind them an arch of white and cream flowers, candlelight everywhere, a room full of guests in formal wear. There was a row of people at the front, her parents, her sisters, her extended family. Everyone arranged as if for a portrait, everyone who mattered, everyone who belonged. I wasn't there. I scrolled. More photos. The reception, the first dance, the toasts, the cake. I looked at every image slowly. I looked for myself in the background of every crowd shot. I wasn't anywhere. There was no photo of my son and his father. There was no mention in any caption. I looked at the comments. Congratulations. What a beautiful couple. They look so happy. That venue is stunning. Her dress, his smile. What a night. One comment from her father. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. Welcome to the family, son. Son. Her father called my son, son, and my son had responded with a red heart. I set my phone face down on the kitchen table. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold. I sat there for a long time, looking out the back window at the yard, the old oak tree, the fence I'd replaced 3 summers ago, the corner where I used to set up a pitching net when he was 8. I tried to remember the last time he'd hugged me. I couldn't pinpoint it. I didn't cry. I'm 67 years old. I've buried a wife. I've had 2 surgeries. I've been alone long enough that I've learned the difference between grief that moves through you and grief that just settles in like furniture. This was something else. This was clarity. The kind that costs something. I want to tell you something. It's important. My son didn't forget me because he was careless. I know that now. This was deliberate. Deliberate in the same way that you plan a seating chart deliberately. You decide who belongs at the table, and you work backward from there. He made that decision. He decided I didn't fit. He decided that the version of himself he was presenting to her family, to their friends, to their world, didn't include a father with rough hands and a truck, and a working-class house with a practical kitchen table. So he quietly, methodically, over a period of months, moved me to the margins, until the margins fell off the page entirely. The hardest part of understanding that is what comes before the anger. It's the inventory. You go back through everything and you start to see the pattern. The shortened visits, the unanswered calls, the way he'd redirected me when I asked about her family, the engagement party I wasn't invited to, all of it. And you realize that while you were being patient, being understanding, giving him room to grow, he was constructing the version of his life that didn't require you, piece by piece, without ever having the courage to say it to your face. I opened the app again the next morning. I found the post. I read it again, slower. There were 146 comments. I read every one of them. There was a long post from his new wife describing the night, and in it she thanked everyone who made it possible. Her parents, her bridesmaids, the coordinator, the photographer, her college roommate who flew in from Seattle. My son had commented on her post. Couldn't imagine doing any of this without you all. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I got up, went to my bedroom, and opened the closet. On the top shelf, behind some old shoeboxes, I kept a metal document box that I'd had for 20 years. Inside it were my discharge papers from the Army, my marriage certificate, my wife's death certificate, the deed to my house, and a folded sheet of paper I hadn't looked at in about 2 years. It was the promissory note. When I gave my son the $60,000, I'd had my attorney draft a simple promissory note. Not because I expected him to default, not because I didn't trust him. I did it because I'd learned from 31 years of business that the kindest thing you can do in a financial arrangement is make it official. The note stated that I had loaned him $60,000 at zero interest to be repaid at his discretion. It had both of our signatures. It had no expiration date, which meant it was callable at any time at my discretion. He had repaid $40,000. He still owed me $20,000. I folded the promissory note and set it on the kitchen table. Then I went out to the driveway and looked at the truck. When my son started the brokerage, part of what made it viable in the early months was the fact that he could use my truck for local freight runs while he built his client base. I had retired from long haul by then and didn't need it for work anymore. I told him to use it. He had been using it, on and off, for about 4 years. We'd never formalized anything because it was family, and family doesn't always formalize things. The truck was registered in my name, had been since I bought it, and I'd never signed anything transferring it. I stood in the driveway looking at that truck for a few minutes. Then I went back inside and called my attorney. I want to be honest about what I felt in those days. It wasn't rage. I know what rage feels like. I felt it the night my wife died, and I sat in a hospital parking garage and couldn't make myself drive home. Rage is hot and disorienting. What I felt now was the opposite. It was cold and perfectly still, like a room where the windows have been sealed. I was calm in a way I hadn't been in months, maybe longer, because I had finally stopped waiting for something that was never going to happen. And that kind of release has its own quiet energy. My attorney is a woman I've worked with for 15 years. When I explained the situation, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "The note is enforceable. The truck is yours by clear title. There are no complications here." She asked if I was certain. I told her I was. She said she'd have paperwork ready within 24 hours. I spent that evening on the back porch. It was a warm night for that time of year. I could hear the neighbors somewhere down the block, kids playing, somebody's lawnmower still going in the last of the light. Normal Tuesday life continuing around me while something inside me was finally, after all these months, going still. I thought about the first time I put my son in that truck. He was maybe 9, and I was doing a short regional run and brought him along on a summer day off from school. He sat up in the cab and watched everything, the highway spreading out ahead of us, the mirrors, the gauges, asking me questions about every control. He fell asleep on the way back with his head against the window and his mouth open a little, and I drove very carefully the whole last hour so I wouldn't wake him. I remembered thinking, this is enough. This right here is enough. I thought about that, and then I let it sit where it sat, and I went to bed. The next morning, I signed the paperwork. My attorney filed the promissory note demand notice, which meant my son had 30 days to repay the remaining $20,000. Additionally, since the truck had been in my possession and name throughout, and no formal loan agreement had been executed, I was within my rights to reclaim it. I arranged to have it picked up from where he kept it parked at his warehouse lot on Thursday. I did not call him first. I know how that sounds. I want to explain it clearly. I didn't call him first because he hadn't called me. He hadn't called me to tell me he was engaged. He hadn't called me to invite me to his wedding. He hadn't called me after the wedding to say, "Dad, I owe you an explanation." He had not called me for anything that wasn't about something he needed. So I decided that this time, the news would travel the same way his had. He would find out through the echo. He would find out when it arrived. My phone started ringing on Thursday afternoon. I let it ring. He called 4 times in 40 minutes. Then a text message. "Dad, what is happening? Call me." Then, "Where is my truck?" Then, "Are you serious right now?" Then a string of messages that escalated the way a person escalates when they realize the thing they assumed was permanent has moved. I turned the volume down and made myself a sandwich. He showed up at my door on Friday morning at 7:45. I heard the rental car before I saw it, some mid-sized sedan idling hard up the street. He knocked with the urgency of a man who hadn't slept. I set down my coffee and walked to the door and opened it. He looked bad. Not unkempt, he was still dressed like his wife's family expected him to be dressed, collar and slacks, even at 7:45 in the morning. But his eyes were the eyes of a man who'd been running calculations all night, and none of them were coming out right. He looked at me, and I could see him searching for the version of me he knew how to handle. The patient one, the accommodating one, the one who would say, "Come in, son. Let's talk this through." I stepped back and let him in, without saying anything. He walked into the living room and turned to face me. "Dad, what is this?" His voice was tightly controlled, the way you control something that could shake loose if you're not careful. "I need you to explain what's happening." I sat down in my chair. I told him to sit down. He didn't sit. He stood there with his hands at his sides. "Dad, the truck is critical to 3 contracts right now. I have drivers scheduled. What are you doing?" I looked at him for a moment. I asked him how the honeymoon was. That stopped him. He blinked. "What?" I said I heard it was somewhere nice. The photos looked beautiful, what I could see of them. The venue inside the reception hall especially. A lot of flowers. He went quiet. He understood what I was saying. He pulled in a breath and let it out slowly. "Dad, I know you're upset." I told him I wasn't upset. I told him I was clear. He sat down then. Not in the chair across from me, but on the edge of the couch, perched, like a man prepared to leave at any moment. He rubbed his hands together the way he used to do when he was a kid working up to telling me something he'd broken. I hadn't seen that gesture in years, and it hit me somewhere low in the chest that I hadn't expected. "I understand why you're angry," he said. I told him I wasn't angry. He looked at me. "Then what is this?" I told him it was simple arithmetic. I had given him the use of a truck that remained in my name. I was reclaiming it. I had lent him money with a signed promissory note. I was calling the remaining balance. Both of those things were within my rights, and had been the whole time. He said, "Dad, those were family arrangements." I told him they were legal documents. He ran a hand across his face. "You're doing this because of the wedding." I told him I was doing this because of the whole truth of it, of which the wedding was the final chapter. I told him to think back, not to the wedding, but to the year before it, to the calls I'd made that sat on voicemail, to the engagement I'd heard about from a stranger in a hardware store, to the times I'd asked if there was anything I could do to help and been told he'd let me know, to every quiet, patient thing I had done while he was quietly, patiently moving me out of his life. He didn't say anything. I told him there was one specific thing I needed him to answer, not for me to decide whether to take back the truck. That was decided. But because I had been carrying the question for weeks and I needed to hear him say it out loud, I asked him whether he had ever intended to invite me to his wedding, whether, at any point during the months of planning, it had been a real consideration. He looked at the floor. I waited. He said, "Her family has a certain way of doing things." I waited some more. He said, "I didn't want there to be tension." I asked him where the tension was going to come from. He looked up and I could see him trying to find the words that would make the truth sound better than it was. He said, "Dad, her family is there different from us. From how we grew up, I didn't want you to feel out of place. I didn't want things to be uncomfortable." I asked him, "Uncomfortable for who?" He didn't answer. I asked him again, quiet as I could, because I wanted him to hear it clearly. "Uncomfortable for who, son?" He looked at me and his jaw tightened. "For me, Dad. Okay? For me. I didn't want to spend my wedding day managing the gap between my father and her family. I didn't want to be watching you across the room and worrying. I just wanted one day where everything fit together." There it was. One day where everything fit together, and I was the thing that didn't fit. I sat with that for a moment. Not because it surprised me. I had already known it. I had known it since the hardware store, maybe before that. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and hearing it said. Hearing it said gives it a weight that knowing alone doesn't have, and that weight, when it settles on you, changes the shape of everything. I told him I appreciated him saying it plainly. I told him it was the first honest thing he'd said to me in a long time. He said, "Dad, please, the truck is." I told him the truck wasn't a negotiation. I told him the promissory note wasn't a negotiation. I told him I wasn't calling those things in to punish him, though I understood why it felt that way. I told him the truth, which was that I had given him everything I could give for 30 years, And the only thing I had ever asked in return was to matter, not to be impressive, not to fit a certain aesthetic, just to matter. And he had made his answer to that very clear. He was crying by then. Not loudly, not theatrically, just quietly, the way men cry when they've run out of argument. He said, "I love you, Dad." I said I believed that he believed that. I said that wasn't the same thing as showing up. He asked me what showing up looked like to me. I told him it looked like a phone call when you get engaged. It looked like a seat at the table when you get married. It looked like coming to see your father when he's sick instead of telling him to make some soup and rest up. It looked like not arranging your life so that the man who built everything you're standing on is invisible to the people you're trying to impress. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. I told him I wasn't going to tell him the truck was coming back. I told him the $20,000 was due within 30 days and that my attorney had the documentation and he should speak with her if he had questions. I told him he was welcome to come by for dinner sometime if he wanted to, and that I would be civil and I would cook something good and we could talk like men who shared a history. But I was not going to undo what I'd done, because what I'd done was not wrong. I had simply stopped pretending that one-sided sacrifice was the same thing as a relationship. He sat on my couch for a long time without moving. I waited. I didn't try to fill the silence. The silence was doing necessary work. Eventually, he stood up. He looked around the room, at the photos on the wall, at the practical furniture, at the kitchen table visible through the doorway. He looked at all of it the way you look at something you might have misjudged. Then he looked at me. He said he didn't know how to fix this. I told him I wasn't sure it could be fixed the way he meant, but it could be rebuilt if he was willing to do that slowly, from the ground up, with honesty, that I was not going anywhere, that I was here, in this house, at this table, the same place I had always been, that the door wasn't closed on my end, but I was done being the only one who walked through it. He nodded once. He picked up his keys from the end table where he'd set them. He walked to the front door and paused with his hand on the frame. He didn't turn around. He stood there for just a moment, and then he walked out. I listened to the rental car back down the driveway and pull away down the street. I listened until I couldn't hear it anymore. Then I went to the kitchen and refilled my coffee and carried it out to the back porch and sat down in the old chair I'd had out there for years, the one with the split in the armrest that I'd been meaning to fix. It was a mild morning. The oak tree was doing what it does in the fall, that slow release, one leaf at a time. A cardinal was working the feeder I'd put up the spring before, that hard red against the gray of the fence. I sat there and I breathed, and I did not feel what I expected to feel. I expected to feel empty, or righteous, which is just a dressed-up version of empty. What I felt instead was more like solid, like something that had been leaning for a long time had been straightened and nailed into place. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like finishing. Like I had finally told the truth about what I was and what I was worth. Not with words, but with action. And the truth, once told, has a particular kind of weight to it that nothing else does. I want to say something to you, whoever is listening to this story right now, wherever you are. We tell ourselves that giving without condition is the highest form of love. And maybe it is. But there is a version of that we don't talk about. The version where giving without condition becomes giving without consequence. Where the people we love learn that no matter what they do, no matter how they treat us, the supply never runs out. And when they learn that, they stop valuing the supply. They stop valuing us. Not because they're cruel, necessarily, because we taught them not to. Because we were so committed to unconditional love that we made ourselves unconditionally available, unconditionally forgiving, unconditionally small. I spent 67 years being large in the ways that mattered, carrying things, building things, sacrificing things, and small in the ways that were supposed to be virtuous. I didn't ask for thanks. I didn't ask to be acknowledged. I didn't ask to take up space. And my son, who loved me in his way, learned from all of that I didn't need space, that I was fine wherever I was placed, that the consideration I never demanded was the consideration I didn't require. He was wrong, but I helped him believe it. This isn't a story about revenge. Not really. I want to be clear about that. I didn't take back the truck to hurt him. I took it back because it was mine. And because for the first time in years I was willing to act like the things that are mine are worth keeping. I called in the note because a signed agreement is a signed agreement, and because the only way to teach someone that your word has weight is to treat your own word like it has weight. What I hope, and I do mean this, is that my son will be a better husband than he was a son. I hope he will look at the man beside him and think about what it means to be chosen and not waste it. I hope, someday, when he has children of his own, he will understand what it cost his grandfather to get up in the dark on a February morning in Amarillo, because the job doesn't wait, and maybe then he'll call. If he does, I'll answer. The door on my end has never been the one that's closed. If this story landed somewhere in you, if it touched something you've been carrying quietly, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've been there. Tell me what you did. We're not as alone in this as it can feel at 3 a.m. And I think sometimes the most important thing is just knowing that someone else has sat in this same chair and felt this same weight and decided to stop making themselves smaller to make the room feel more comfortable for everyone else. Subscribe to Eclipse Vengeance if you want to keep hearing stories like this one. Stories about people who reached the point where enough was enough, who chose dignity over the comfort of pretending everything was fine. There are more of us than you think. There are always more of us than you think. I'll see you in the next one.